Hello and welcome to another instalment of the Wyfutbol podcast with me, Michael Dryden and Etches Adogru. Today, I am very pleased to say we are joined by Ben Stanfield. Ben is the founder and host of the Total Saints podcast, a podcast dedicated to all things Southampton. And he's joining us today as we look at Southampton's mixed season so far. Ralph Hasenhüttl, projections for the rest of the season and beyond that. So Ben, welcome to the show. Firstly, how are you? And secondly, is mixed the right way to describe the season so far?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it. It's nice, I think, always to the shoes on the other foot. I spend my life hosting my podcast. It's nice to come on and answer a few questions. Hopefully, sound like I know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I think mixed is the perfect word, Michael. Roller coaster is probably another one that I'd use. But as a Saints fan of 35 years, you get used to being on the roller coaster. We were just talking, weren't we, about you being a Sunderland fan? You'll know exactly what a roller coaster is. So
Yep.
yeah, we had a fantastic first half of the season. We were celebrating being top of the league, and then suddenly here we are. 10 games to go. We're looking over our shoulder and hoping Fulham don't win too many games. To be honest with
you. Yeah, well, Sunderland's neighbours, Newcastle, are currently the team or the big team and mainstay of the league that everyone's kind of looking at and thinking, are they going to be the ones to drop? But I suppose Southampton aren't too far off that currently. Particularly that loss to Brighton didn't help that, did it?
No, I mean, we probably need one more win, maybe one more win and a draw, and then we're just about safe. Because I mean, you're looking at Fulham and Newcastle, and Fulham are 7 points behind us, so they've pretty much got to win probably 5 of their last remaining games to sort of catch up and things like that as well, which would be a tough ask. So yeah, I don't think you can ever be too comfortable, and I think Saints have maybe been a little sort of neglectful at taking their foot off the pedal the last few weeks. I think they probably thought they were cruising to safety, and then as you well know, guys, it's hard to try and claw back the momentum sometimes when it's going against you.
Yeah, no, rightly so. I think what we will do, Ben, is we'll start on a brighter note, and we'll discuss the FA Cup win against Bournemouth because,
Lovely.
Yeah, exactly. I think no matter when something's going poor for a season, cup football can almost be an escape. So kind of the first question I kind of had was, as a Saints fan during this kind of season that you're going through, do you think Southampton can actually win it? Or has the journey been good enough for you to just say, okay, let's sack this off now and focus on the league?
So I guess as we all look at it with Manchester City in there, you can never say, I think you've got an overly good chance. Obviously, we did quite well to avoid them in the semi, so it does give us a chance. Of course, we're playing Leicester, a team that I still can't take the score. It makes me shake too much. But obviously, Leicester beat us by X-0 a few years back. And so, of course, there's going to be a lot of chat about that. But I think being honest, actually, this sounds really sort of, I suppose, modern day fanish to say, but even before the Bournemouth game at the weekend, I think because Saints have lost 10 out of 12 in the league, it was a bit like, a struggle to really get yourself up for it. And I think that's partly because, we can't get to games at the moment and we're obviously in this sort of lockdown cycle. And I was sort of reflecting on it after the game, thinking we just reached the semi-final of FA Cup, the greatest cup competition probably in the world. I think, again, as I just said, being a Saints fan of 35 years, I've grown up and lived with the FA Cup, and I think it's something that we're never going to win the Premier League, so you want to have a good cup run, and you get to the semi-final, and you almost sort of take it for granted. I mean, we've won 4 games, we've not even let a goal in. They've done really, really well in that, and I think as a fan, I should be a lot more grateful and a lot more gracious about the fact that we've done that. So actually, I'm starting to sort of try and flip my perception around and say, do you know what? Fair play. We've reached the semi-final. I should really get excited about this. Yes, we got a chance of beating Leicester. Likewise, they'll think they've got a chance of beating us. But ultimately, it's a chance for us to save our season. And I said this to the guys on our pod at the weekend. If someone had said to us at the start of the season, with 10 games to go in the league, you'll be 14th in an FA Cup semi-final, would we have taken that, yes or no? And I think the overriding answer was yes. And the fact that we're maybe thinking about it so negatively is because we've lost 10 out of 12 in the league and we've only gone one direction. So it's a funny old game, as someone once said.
Yeah, it is indeed. And kind of the question I kind of had was, I saw a table. I'm an Arsenal fan, so sometimes when I'm being attacked by my friends about Arsenal not being very good, I always put a picture up of the Premier League table since Christmas, because I think we're third in that.
Yeah, but actually, I've got a good idea where we are.
Yeah, you've read my mind. You've read my mind there.
Yeah.
You should be a detective. But unfortunately, Southampton are at the bottom.
I thought you were going to say that.
And the question I kind of had was, what's gone wrong since Christmas? It's such an open-ended question, but how has it gone so wrong?
I think there's a variety of sort of mitigating factors. I think first things first, they've lost form. I think it sounds sarcastic to say that probably, but the players that were performing so well before Christmas, I think the 8s and 9s and 10 out of 10s that we were getting have become 5s, 6s and 7s. And Ralph Hasenhüttl said earlier in the season, we have to be at 100% to beat teams. Undoubtedly, we've beaten Liverpool. I mean, that ironically before Sheffield United the other night, that was the last game we'd won. They're the champions. So that just reiterates the sort of funny season we've had. We had a lot of injuries, and lots of clubs have had injuries because of this compressed season. I don't think Saints have managed it very well. I think they've tried to rush players back because they've been struggling a little bit. And then, as we saw with Kyle Walker-Peters, he came back, he played 2 games in 4 days. He was then out for another 3 weeks. So they've had about 8, 9 players out, Etche. And the problem with Saints is, anyone outside the top 6 probably has this problem. We've probably got 15 or 16 top quality players. Now, if you suddenly get 8 or 9 injuries, you're then playing 8 or 9 senior players. You've got a couple of youngsters in. I mean, everyone will remember that game at Manchester United when we bought a 19-year-old and he got sent off after 73 seconds. That's kind of just the scenario we went through. So I think playing Saturday, Wednesday, Sunday, Tuesday, that sort of thing really didn't help. So first things first, I think they lost their confidence. I think the manager made a few mistakes along the way, and it's just kind of snowballed from there. But I think, to be fair to them, the injuries have not helped, and they're starting to get a few players back now. We picked up a draw against Chelsea. We beat Sheffield United. We beat Bournemouth. There's a little bit of momentum again now, heading in the right direction.
So you mentioned the 9-0 with United. I know form has started to dip a little bit. I've got my form book up in front of me. You lost against Aston Villa the game before, but do you think that has been a factor, or because it is a very much an anomaly as it was with the Leicester result?
Yeah, it's. I suppose another mitigating factor. And again, every team has suffered with this, so I think it's naive of me to sit here and say this has been the major issue. But I think for any neutral that watched that Aston Villa game, we had a really blatant handball against Matty Cash that wasn't given at 0-0. It went to Mike Dean somehow. Didn't see it. We then had Danny Ings was about a gnat's whisker offside in the 94th minute with an equaliser. We then went up to United, and again, we had Mike Dean, who's been the VAR against Villa 3 days before and not given us a penalty. Everyone will remember, Anthony Martial dived and he went over and watched it on the screen and then still gave the penalty and sent Bednarek off, and that was at 6-0. And again, there's no excuse for shipping 9 goals, but I think that game, unlike Leicester, Leicester totally played us off the park the night when they beat us. But to be fair, I think the last 3 goals there were kind of, Mike Dean had pretty much sucked all the wind out of Saints. They were playing with 9 men. United were all over us at that stage, and I think that was kind of the mitigating situation. So again, VAR hasn't been our friend the last few weeks, but I think every club could say that.
Yeah, I think it's spot on. The challenge which one of the red cards was given for, the second one, hurt me as well, because Arsenal had a very similar challenge with David Luiz against Wolves.
That's right, yeah.
So we won't get dragged into the whole what is a penalty, is it double jeopardy, and all that sort of stuff, because I'll end up in tears. So what we will talk.
But the weird thing, actually, but the weird thing is, right? So Jan Bednarek's got rescinded, right? So he then played at Newcastle, but David Luiz's didn't, and they were very, very similar tackles. And I think that probably sums up for all of us the kind of the frustration of being a fan at the moment.
Yeah, it is a massive frustration, and David Luiz is an interesting one, because he's got that reputation, hasn't he? And yeah, if we could do a whole episode on refereeing decisions this season, from VAR to on the field decisions, but I won't get dragged into it too much. But what you did speak about was momentum, and how Southampton had lost theirs. Do you think they should have done more in the January transfer window? I know Minamino came in and scored that wonderful goal against Chelsea, where he sent 2 players to the chip shop and back. But do you think they needed to do more, especially in the fullback area? I know Southampton are a bit light at the moment.
100% in the fullback situation. Yeah, as fans, that was like our number one prime position that we needed to sort out. And in true Saint style, Etche, we ended up loaning Jan Valery to Birmingham, who was our spare right back. And as Michael will well know, Jake Vakins, who was our spare left back, went to Sunderland. So not only did we then not have any cover, we didn't bring anyone else in. And ironically, we contacted Liverpool about Nico Williams late in the day, and they said, well, Nico Williams isn't available, but if you fancy Takuni Minamino, then he could be available. So we ended up going to Liverpool for a right back and signing an attacking midfielder. That kind of summed up our whole January strategy, to be honest with you. So yeah, they left themselves short. And again, that's something that's really paid the price the last few weeks.
So Vokins, I have to ask, Was he someone who was highly rated at Southampton?
Yeah, I think in terms of he's obviously still fairly young, and I know he hasn't played a lot at Sunderland. I think going forward, he's good. Good left foot, whipping and crosses, but defensively, that's why Ralph Hasenhüttl didn't really rate him. Again, he's
Mm.
our prime left back is Ryan Bertrand, as you guys will know, an experienced pro, Champions League winner. He's a class player when he wants to be. So there's a chalk and cheese gap there. But when he did bring Vokins in as sort of cover a couple of times, tried him, he just got found out in the Premier League. And I think the fact he's not playing for you guys, Michael, probably tells you how far he's got to go to develop.
Yeah, I was going to say, 'cause he has looked a little bit shook when he's played at this level, because it is a bit of a culture shock. If you're someone like Vokins, I don't know his background, but say, for example, if he has played it within Saints Academy under 23 football, even if you move up to the Premier League, is a consistent kind of style of football, very much a nicer style of football than you might find in League One. And he has found it a bit difficult to adapt. I think he looks like a decent player, but I was just interested because he hasn't hit the ground running, but he played against Arsenal in the league. So I expected a bit more.
Yeah, that's Ryan's one bit linking. As I mentioned earlier, anything, all roads basically lead to Sunderland on this podcast.
I think that was partly my fault. Actually, wasn't it? I kind of led him down that one.
It wasn't. Don't blame me.
We obviously discussed the January transfer window and kind of what Southampton maybe should have done. But I also read briefly at the time when the writing was on the wall for Frank Lampard, Hasenhüttl's name was thrown into the mix. I think so was Nagelsmann and maybe another European name. I know that Allegri always seems to be linked with these jobs. Do you think that kind of had an effect on the team? It was quite light rumours, and Tuchel was always seen to be the favourite. But I remember reading at the time it was quite a big turnaround, after the result we won't talk about, how he's gone from flirting with top of the league to then being linked with Chelsea was quite a fantastic turnaround. But I just wondered if it maybe affected the team slightly.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know that, wouldn't it? I think more importantly, it'd be interesting to know how it's affected Hasenhüttl himself, because, when he first came to England, he said in his first press conference, I'm here to make a name for myself. I want to manage a big club. And I think as Saints fans, again, we have to understand, you look at the players that have come through the last few years, we are a conveyor belt, a stepping stone, whatever you want to call it. So not a problem with that, because if he wants to come in and make a name for himself, ultimately the only way he's going to do that is by winning games, and that'll be good for us in the short term, right? But the Tuchel thing happened quite quickly, didn't it? So there wasn't a lot of mass hysteria for a couple of weeks, and God, Hasenhüttl's going to leave and all that sort of thing, because kind of Lampard was out, and then I think it was literally a day or so later, wasn't it, that Tuchel was in. So I do feel that Hasenhüttl probably was interested, and if there'd been a conversation to be had at Che, I think he would have been keen to do it. So I almost wonder how sort of disgruntled he was, that he probably thought, well, I've been here in the Premier League for 18 months, I've kind of proven myself, why wouldn't you take a chance on me? So it'll be interesting to see when the next big opportunity comes along and he does get linked with that, whether it sort of mothballs into anything bigger or not.
Yeah, no, that'd be a really interesting point to kind of see and kind of get under the microscope on. But kind of generally with Hasenhüttl, you mentioned just before how fans would be sad to see him leave. Generally now, is he? I would assume he's safe, but you never really know with management. I remember when you first came back to the Premier League, or the last time he came up, and Adkins was the manager.
Yep.
And I remember I sat home with my dad, because I think Southampton were, I want to say 13th or 14th in the league. Adkins left and Pochettino came in. I remember my dad was like, that's a mistake, because Adkins is going to do really well, and Pochettino, I think he got sacked or had left Espanyol, and obviously it turned out to be a very good move, and I don't know what I'm talking about. So the question I kind of have to you is Hasenhüttl's job safe for the time being, or should they look to change, or is that just nonsense?
Yeah, I think the problem that Saints have is they had, after Koeman left and went to Everton, we then had Claude Puel, who we sacked. We then replaced him with Maurizio Pellegrino, who we sacked. We then had Mark Hughes for about 4 months, as everyone will remember. And then in the summer of that year, we offered him a 3-year contract, which was an incredible piece of strategic work. We then sacked him 3 months later, and then eventually Hasenhüttl came in. The problem is, Saints haven't got a lot of money, and with the pandemic the way it's going at the moment, I think we reported about 70 million loss for 2019-20. I imagine, like lots of clubs, 2020-21 accounts are going to be pretty grim as well. So Hasenhüttl signed a new 4-year contract in the summer. It's but from what I understand, I mean, it would cost about 18 million to sack him. So again, it costs a lot of money, doesn't it, to sack managers in football? So I think, money aside, I think they are keen, and we do need some stability. It's the same group of players pretty much that the last 3 or 4 managers have had, and they've always been battling relegation. So I think, to be fair, he does need investment to kind of build his own squad, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I guess the point I'm making is, if you keep sacking your managers, but you still got the same group of players, you are generally going to struggle. So I think fans really do appreciate Ralph Hasenhüttl. He certainly put a lot of passion into it. He developed a new SFC playbook with the club back in the summer about this sort of pathway from the academy to the first team, and all of the sort of under 18s, the B team, kind of training in the same way and playing their games in the same formation so that players can naturally step up. So there's a bit more of sort of a roadmap now than maybe there has been, and you kind of want him to stay there for the next 12, 18, 24 months to really help that mature.
I thought you were going to say 12, 18 years there.
I'll take days the way that some of the Saints managers have gone, to be honest. So, yeah.
I mean, it'd be good to get your views on the ownership at Southampton, because I know from experience that you can change your manager every season, and it might work in the short term, but eventually you'll get found out and you make losses because you're sacking managers, you're paying them off, you're having to bring in new signings to fit that new manager's demands and how he wants to play. Eventually, when he then gets sacked, the next one comes in, and that process kind of starts again, and you end up just spiraling into debt, which happened to the club that I won't name on this podcast anymore, but it happened to Sunderland. And I'm interested to know if you have any information on the ownership and whether or not they're looking to sell, because that really is where Southampton are going to actually turn things around in the long term.
100%. So, I mean, again, from my fairly limited knowledge, absolutely they're up for sale. I think there's been a lot of talk about it they've probably been up for sale for 18 months or so now. I think for those people that maybe on social media or listen to TalkSport, I think Simon Jordan was talking about it the other day, that he'd been approached as part of a consortium. So again, I think the word is definitely out there. I mean, from what I understand, it's about 180 million that they're up for sale. I think Gal bought them for 210 million. That was for 80%. But basically, they've been run as a sustainable business. And to be fair, we've got some really I would say ethical and sort of morally compass-driven people at the club that are trying to run it in the right way. The problem for Saints, as you guys will know, is our model has always been buy players for 10, 15, 20 million, sell them for 30, 40 million. That's kind of how you run as a sustainable business. But going back to the point I just made, the reason that we've not sold many players the last few years is because all of our best ones ended up at Liverpool, and we were kind of left with what was left. And that's why there's so many rumours around about Danny Ings going this summer, or Yannick Vestergaard going this summer. I mean, Ings has got just over about 15 months left on his contract. Saints may have to sell him for 20, 25 million this summer if a Spurs or a Man City come in, because, as I said, I mean, the financial results aren't going to be great. So if you've got an owner that's not investing and a club that is losing money, sooner or later, that's going to, as you say, get you into problems. So I don't think it's panic stations at the moment. And going back to your original question, absolutely, we need to try and get someone to come in and buy the club and invest in it. But trying to sell a football club in the middle of a pandemic for 180 million, when you've just reported 70 million loss, and there's probably going to be near on that again next year, I can't say I'd be sort of jumping at the chance to do that, to be honest.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Newcastle United, look at Mike Ashley. There's a lot of reasons other than how Mike Ashley has handled Newcastle as to the reason why people dislike him. But if you're the fan base at Newcastle, he has actually run that club fairly sustainably. So he's been there a lot longer than what your owner has, and he has run that quite sustainably. But he's had a lot of allegations thrown at him because when you sell players and don't reinvest it in the club or in the playing team, you get accused of taking that money out of the club. And then also running a football club sustainably in the Premier League isn't always the way in which you grow in the Premier League, because people around you might be actually spending a lot more than they can afford. And while it's noble and it's good for the club in the long term to be sustainable, it eventually will start to grind on fans if they see their rival spending a lot more in the transfer market and building their team.
Exactly, Michael. I couldn't agree with you more. And you look at like an Aston Villa this summer. I mean, obviously, they're in a slightly different scenario. They've come up from a championship budget into the Premier League. They've obviously managed to stay up. So they're kind of spending that money that's going to come down the line from parachute payments if they got relegated and things like that, which obviously isn't going to happen this year. But again, that's the modern football fan. Saints fans see Aston Villa spending, I don't know what it was, 25 million on Ollie Watkins. Why aren't we trying to sign him? Why are we losing out to players to Aston Villa? But the fact is, Saints are a lot further down the line, and they haven't got 25, 50 million to spend on two players. We're trying to sign players again, for 10, 15 million. And I go back to what I said. I mean, our transfer and our recruitment over the last few years, we bought in Guido Carrillo for 19 million. He played 7 games and he was shipped out on loan twice. We then let him go for free this summer. Sofiane Boufal, another player that we signed for about 15 to 18 million. He's left on a free, with all those wages that we've had to sort of sign off with him as well. Mario Lemina, same sort of price. He's currently on loan at Fulham, who we're battling to stay up against. I mean, there's been so many sort of poor recruitment. I mean, we must have spent 80 to 100 million over the last. Mohamed El Younousi, another player who's up at Celtic. It's just not worked out. And those are the players that we kind of signed with a view to we will sell them on and that will be our model. And when that's not happening, as you say, it's gonna, there's going to be a few sort of difficult conversations to have at some point along the line, definitely.
I was going to ask, has there been a change in that regards? Because I know from the days you mentioned before of Mane, Van Dijk, Lallana, Luke Shaw. I know Luke Shaw is obviously academy, but has there been a shift in Southampton in terms of the recruitment, or is it one of those things where we discussed it before we had a call with you actually? If you sell Van Dijk and then you sell his replacement, and then you sell his replacement, eventually there's going to become a point where, you may not get it right. Is that what's happening with Southampton, or is it more of a general problem that's going on there, do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's pretty much what's happened. I think we obviously had a bit of a change of regime. The likes of Les Reed left, Ross Wilson, who was our head of recruitment, went up to Rangers, Ralph Kruger, who was our chairman, left. And I'm not saying that these guys left at the top of their game as well. They got a little bit stale, and I think they'd got a bit too carried away. And the current regime that we've got at the club, Etche, kind of having to undo that work. As I say, free transfers, loaning players out. They can't spend the money that they haven't got. But yeah, I mean, we basically had what you think of a few years back. We had Toby Alderweireld, right? And we then tried to sign him, and obviously Spurs came in and he went to Spurs. So we signed Virgil van Dijk, a step up, and that was a player that we signed for 15 million, sold for 75 million. Perfect, perfect for the sustainable model. We then sold him, and his replacement was a guy that we were expecting to play in his position called Wesley Hoyt, who was absolutely dreadful. He's been out on loan 3 or 4 times. He's currently at Lazio. He's out of contract, I think this summer, if not next summer. We're not going to get tuppence for him. So that position, centre back, kind of that almost hits your nail on the head in terms of that model is now broken, and we're now trying to find another player, which could be like a Vestergaard, to kind of start that process again.
Yeah, Vestergaard's been a great signing, and he's also huge as well. I didn't realise how tall he was.
Yeah.
He's the tallest player in the Premier League. But a point as well that I'd make is, and again, it happened with us at Sunderland, you bring in a player from, say, the continent. I mean, Vestergaard's been a good example of where that's worked out. But say he didn't work out and he came into Southampton, you have to pay them a higher wage than what they'd get on the continent, typically. I mean, Borussia Mönchengladbach, I believe he came from their side that plays in Europa League. They're quite a good side. Perhaps he didn't take a big pay hike to come to the Premier League. But then once they're there, if they don't do so well and you can't ship them on to another Premier League club, who are likely just going to take them on loan if you're desperate to sell, it's very difficult to sell them back to the continent because that player is not going to want to lose that Premier League wage. And that continental club, we signed a couple of players from France, for example. Didier Ndong would be the big one, whose name gets mentioned on this podcast quite a lot. Where you try then to send them back or sell them back to that nation or to the continent, it's very, very difficult because that player doesn't want to lose that wage. And then you end up stuck with this player for so long.
Exactly. I mean, we had Toby Steele, the managing director of Saints, on the pod before Christmas, and he obviously oversees a lot of the finances and things like that. He was pretty much saying exactly what you said there, which is there's this joke about, a player wants to come to the Premier League, add a naught onto the wage that you're thinking about. If he's thinking of 5,000, make it 50,000. He said, joking aside, not in every instance, but that is pretty much it. Premier League is seen as the golden goose of European football, isn't it? Players, not every player, but lots of players come here because they know that it will pretty much set them up for life. And you're spot on. I mean, even those players that we've had to send out on loan the last 2-3 years, I imagine Saints have been paying 70-80% of their wages, even when they've gone to clubs like Leganes and as Guido Carrillo did, because we were paying him 70 grand a week and they were probably paying 10 grand of that, so the hit that we're taking just to try and get rid of these players, I'm not saying it's happening in every instance, because we've done some good recruitment, and there's players that are now working out. Shea Adams, he's just been called up, as you guys will know. He's obviously Scottish through and through. Players like that we bought in and have developed, but there are unfortunately 3 or 4 or 5 of them in that squad that are just never going to work out. And I imagine at some point they will just leave on free transfers, and that's £100 million worth of business down the drain, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a classic story from Sunderland is Sebastian Coates was a Sunderland player whilst in the Championship. To get his wage bill off the books, we then loaned him out to Sporting Lisbon. and he was then playing Champions League football for Sporting Lisbon, actually starting, and he actually scored midweek. I remember seeing his name crop up as he scored in the Champions League, thinking, why are we suddenly loaning out a player who's playing the Champions League? We're probably paying half his wage. But you're exactly right. It's exactly what happens, because agents know that a lot of these clubs are desperate because they have short-term incentives in the Premier League, and staying up is a massive deal. They know that, and so you end up paying a premium wage, and if it goes wrong, then you'll collapse, much like we have. So
kind of another question for you, Ben. This is a bit of a tricky one, which includes some maths. So I've known Dryden since 2012. How many times do you think he's told me the story about Sebastian Coates going on loan to Sporting Lisbon?
2012, so that's 9 years actually. Twice a day, 700 times, about 1,000. About 1,000.
You're way off. About in the millions. Every Sebastian Coates without fail. Every time that guy comes up, it's a good point, to be fair, but it's one I've heard. Yeah,
it was a loose connection as well. I jumped at the chance to tell it.
I could sense we were going down that avenue. I thought, is he going to mention Sebastian Coates being on loan? And there it was. So yeah.
Well, we also had Fabio Borini on loan at AC Milan. I mean, it's the same season as well. That's just.
Yeah, you don't fancy the Borini one as much for some reason. I think the Coates one hits home a bit more. Did he play for Liverpool? Yeah, he was at Liverpool, wasn't
he? Yeah, that's Coates.
Yeah, they both were. Yeah, fair play. I think moving back on to the Saints, kind of one of the questions, obviously we spoke about the fullbacks before, is what do Southampton need to strengthen the summer? And it's one of those things, right, where you always ask people that support clubs this, and then fans start giving you ridiculous lists. Like Arsenal will start saying, yeah, Haaland, Mbappe would be a good start. And obviously, yes.
Well, we take both of them, actually, definitely.
But it's more of a case of what realistically can a lot of clubs do, because you're mentioning the profit and loss and the revenue streams at Southampton, and many clubs would be the same. So what would be the priorities that you think Southampton can feasibly do to strengthen this summer?
Yeah, good question. So two parts to this. It was really interesting a few weeks ago, actually. 2-3 weeks back, Ralph Hasenhüttl was asked about getting to the end of the season and what the plan was. And, obviously he didn't want to look too far ahead, but he made a point of saying publicly, the club are going to do all they can this summer to invest in me, invest in the squad, kind of put that public pressure on them, which I thought was really interesting, because I can imagine then you can hear this sort of squabbling argument about why did you say that, and the pressure that sort of builds from it. So he's clearly sending a message to the club about, we can't keep going through this cycle of winning a few games, losing a few games, battling relegation, because that's not ambition enough for me. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But absolutely, fullback, is positions we need to be looking at. It was interesting, they said the other week as well that he now wants 2 players for every position, and he's not necessarily talking about signing 22 players, but he wants to know that if Joe Bloggs can play left back, then Joe Bloggs can also play right back or something like that. So he's got the option, players can play 2 or 3 positions. So fullbacks definitely. Elsewhere, I mean, we're not too bad for cover. I mean, you look at the goalkeeper position, we got Alex McCarthy, Fraser Forster, both ex-England internationals. You look up front, so much relies on the Danny Ings situation, because if he does go, you're then having to sign probably 2 strikers to try and get the goals that he will get. If he stays, you've then got him and Shea Adams. You've got potentially Theo joining on a free transfer who can play up there as well. So I'd say the fullbacks are the key positions, but I think he will try and strengthen almost right up the spine if he can. And I don't know if the money will be there. It'll be interesting to see how they go about it, whether they shop in the continent, free transfers, loans, how they're going to go about it. I think it's going to be a really interesting summer for all of us to kind of watch our clubs and see what happens, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking within as well, I mean, we saw today, you mentioned Jankwitz, who was sent off within 2 minutes against United, but I've seen a lot of people on Twitter today saying that he was their man of the match today for Switzerland under 21s against England. I watched that game; it wasn't great, but he did look good. And he's captain of that side, so it does beg the question. Well, the question generally is, I mean, what's coming through internally? I mean, him is a good example to start with, but who else is coming through?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few coming through. Callum Watts obviously played in the cup game at Shrewsbury. There's Jake Vakins, as we've obviously mentioned. There's Nathan Teller is a fantastic prospect. If anyone watched the Sheffield United game the other week, he won the penalty and ran them pretty ragged. But the interesting thing about Jankovic, I mean, I refer back to that Manchester United game. That was his debut. he got sent off after 73 seconds. You saw Hasenhüttl shaking his head on the line at sort of the rash decision. He's not played since, and he's had a couple of opportunities to play him. And you almost wonder, well, is he teaching him a lesson, or is he thinking, I've lost all confidence in him? He's just going to come on here and there, stops and starts now. Because you're right. I mean, obviously, AD Boothroyd lost another game as England under-21s manager, which seems incredible that he's still in that job. But yeah, that's another conversation, as Etche would say. But Jankovic was man of the match, and obviously did a really good performance. So there's undoubtedly potential there, but I think it's less about that and more about the trust that Hasenhüttl's got or not got in him.
Yeah, I think it has parallels with the Liverpool CVs, that one, because I think in Liverpool CVs, I mean, not the ones that are injured, Nat Phillips in particular and Reece Williams, that's his name. And I kind of feel like it's a situation a little bit differently where they played a few games and it's like, okay, these guys are going to do well for us, or, the future, And then Hendo dropped into the back four and you're thinking, is that, well, a guy that's never played CB before in his life, as far as I'm aware, came through as a right midfielder. What does that send to those youth players? And you're using the example now of a red card. It's there's loads of managers that will say, oh, this tough love or this harsh treatment works for players. But I think in the modern era, it doesn't really. We saw Duncan Ferguson sub off Moise Keane. How long did he play? 20 minutes after coming as a sub.
Yeah.
And, I've watched him since playing for PSG. And it's a completely different player, and was that really beneficial? Is it really beneficial, this kind of tough love approach with young players? I mean, Mourinho will always be there to tell you that it does, and he'll reference, he'll probably reference Luke Shaw's form is linked to him being harsh on him. Knowing Jose, he'll link it somehow, but you make a really good point there where I don't think that type of treatment, either he's lost the confidence in him, as you said, or he's trying to teach him a lesson. But if it's the latter, I don't really think it's the best way to work with the younger players in this era of football.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting subject, isn't it? It probably goes back to the compressed season as well. But Hasenhüttl's a bit like Klopp, actually, from the example you're given there, has taken a bit of criticism from fans because he's trying to strengthen some parts of the team that are struggling, but then he's weakening other parts of the team, if that makes sense. So a bit like, Klopp felt the only way that he could strengthen his defence was to move Henderson and Fabinho back there, but then their midfield was getting overrun. So what he's done, Hasenhüttl, he was playing Bertrand at right back at Man City the other day. At Everton, he had Stuart Armstrong, who's probably our most creative attacking player, playing in the number 6 position, which meant he was nullified going forward because he was having to run backwards. At Man City as well, he then pushed Jack Stevens as centre-back into centre midfield. So I suppose the point I'm making is he's trying to plug holes in the team where we're struggling for fitness and things like that at the moment by moving players out of position rather than actually giving a chance to some of the youngsters where that is their natural position.
Yeah, it's always one of those, isn't it? It's quite a tricky one to get that balance right. And yeah, there's not really, when there's leaks everywhere in terms of the either injuries or form, then it can be quite a tricky balance. And kind of one of the final questions we have for you, or maybe the last one actually, is I find clubs like Southampton quite interesting. I would probably put in West Ham as well. I wouldn't say Everton because of the amount of money Everton have been spending, and West Ham to a degree. But what actually is the aim, do you think, for Southampton? Not just this season, obviously, to stay up, etc., and to finish the league, but next year? Because I think what's happening in the Prem now is because there's so much money involved, there really is two halves of the league where you get one half who are the old top 6 and a few other teams dotted around like Wolves, maybe Leicester and Everton that have a lot of money, that are saying, okay, our aim is to get European football, and some of those teams, so City and Liverpool, is to win the league. But when you look at the other teams, Crystal Palace as well in that argument, what is their actual aim for the season? Because for Southampton, it would be more than saying, to avoid relegation, because Southampton have shown in the past that they're capable of doing that and much more. So what would be the aim, do you think, going into the next year? Top half? Would it be to push the outskirts of Europa?
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, obviously, I think the season dates have been released today, haven't they? From August the 14th to May the 22nd. So obviously, there's going to be an extra couple of months there, really, that will potentially help clubs with smaller squads like Saints. But yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, well, we want to shoot for European football, which I think should ultimately be the target. I mean, we were in European football 2-3 years back, we had a fantastically enjoyable Europa League campaign. I was lucky enough to go to the San Siro and watch Saints, which I never thought would happen in my lifetime. So incredible experience. And you want, it's like players, isn't it? You get a taste of that. And you think, I'd love to go to Madrid or somewhere like that to watch Saints against Atletico or something. But yeah, I mean, I think for Saints, if they can finish in the top half next season, it'll be a step forward, because I think they're going to struggle with the amount of games left now. And whilst it's still fairly tight, just the way form's going, to probably finish in the top half, as you say, when you look at teams like Villa and Wolves and Everton, who are doing pretty well. So for Saints, I think the immediate plan has got to be to try and get into the top half next season, try and push on towards Europe if they can, and obviously at the same time try and push through 2 or 3 academy players and have them as regular starters. I think that will probably be the 2 key sort of strategic objectives for them, really.
Yeah, I think that's a really well-rounded answer. What I like is when fans are really optimistic, but also have their feet on the ground, because parallels as well with, you speak to some of my friends who are Arsenal fans like me, and it's always like, either it's 2 things: either they're very pessimistic, so it's like, oh, we're going to be fighting relegation, or it's, yeah, we should go out and sign 300 million worth of talent and win the league. And it's like, well, obviously it's not really, both of those things are unlikely to happen, but you want to be ambitious and you want to think, okay, what is it we can feasibly do and how can we actually achieve it? So yeah, that was actually a really good answer.
Right, well, that's all for this week. Thank you, Ben, so much for appearing on the podcast and for your insights on Southampton. It really has been a mixed season, but you have got a man in Ralph Hasenhüttl who, does potentially have what it takes to take you up the league, and hopefully with the right investment to come down the line sooner rather than later, then we can see Saints climb up the table and away from that dreaded relegation spot. So yeah, Ben, thank you so much for coming on. Good luck with all your endeavours with the Total Saints podcast, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime.
Yeah, likewise, guys. Really enjoyed it, and likewise, wish you the best of luck with your podcast as well.
Cheers, thanks a lot.
Cheers.